Fundamentally, privacy is core to being human. It gives you these opportunities to evolve and grow.
We consider it in the kind of legal world as a gateway right, whereby you can't exercise your other rights and freedoms unless you have privacy.
It's really important that people are able to feel authentic when they're living their lives. If they feel like they're being watched or their data's being collected, they might feel more constrained in the way they act.
Collecting data is a really important part of decision making. Before I leave the house, I always look at the weather to see if I need to take a coat. If I'm looking for a restaurant, I'll check the menu out online. And if I'm going on a long journey, of course, I'll check the traffic and the route. This is all data-informed decision making. The more data you have, the better decision you can make. As we spend more time online, we're collecting data, but we're also giving it away. If you post on social media and you tag a location, that's a very active form of giving your data away. But there are more passive ways too. For instance, if you're searching for something online or if you add something to your shopping trolley. Now, businesses see this data as hugely valuable. They can predict individuals' behavior and then make business decisions based on that. So, when new technologies are being adopted by companies all over the place to collect and process our data, should we be worried about our privacy?
It's beneficial for corporations to collect personal data on many fronts. More data improves the services I provide as a corporation. Number two, more data allows me to provide you with personalized personalized recommendations, so that they can push you towards buying stuff that you might probably not need.
If data has been collected regarding individual, that might invade privacy, and if that data is misused, then that can be very harmful. We are using these technologies more and more in everyday life. The more we use technology, there's a likelihood that some of the negative consequences of that technology could be introduced inadvertently. And whether that is a small scale or large scale, again, all depends on how widely such technologies are being used. So the implications and the scale by which the personal data can be analyzed and misused may not be fully understood.
A user wants to use a service and they don't care whether the privacy is going to be used for monetization, whether the data is going to be used by a third party. Users do not see an implication on doing it. So therefore, they assume that, okay, it's nothing wrong with it.
It's not just online that our data is being collected. It happens all of the time when we're out in public, when you're paying for something in a shop with your credit card, or walking down the street and being captured on CCTV. Now, some people say that this is necessary to keep us safe, but other people say it's an invasion of privacy. And at the center of this is a new technology called facial recognition, and it's very hotly debated. It's being used by retail businesses to monitor staff, customers, and inventory to try and make businesses more efficient. But it's also hotly debated and controversial because it collects something called biometric data. We spoke to FaceWatch, who are one of the UK's leading suppliers of facial recognition technology, who claim that they're trying to bring their product to market in a responsible way.
How most retailers work is they very rarely see a theft happening. Most of the incidents get recognised when somebody's actually taken some goods. There's a vacant shelf where there used to be a full shelf. I'm Nick Fisher and I'm the CEO of FaceWatch. Previously I was a senior retail director, and so we formed FaceWatch really to help retailers prevent and deter crime in their businesses against a backdrop of ever increasing crime in retail today. You'll be familiar with facial recognition that you use at the airport, where you've got to put your passport down and stare into the camera and you daren't move until the barrier opens. And sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it doesn't. So simply how the technology works is there's a camera that will point at the entrance of the store, it will detect every face, it will send that face up to a cloud, and match it against a watch list that's been built by that retailer or other retailers who share the FaceWatch database. If there's no match to that face, that data is instantly deleted. However, if there is a match, it will send an immediate alert to the store. It will give you some general information about that person, but absolutely no name. So it will tell you why they're on the watch list and whether your store has reported that individual or whether that data has been shared by FaceWatch from another store reporting that data. So therefore, the principle is about preventing and deterring the crime from happening rather than dealing with the crime that will happen in your store. And if you think about it, asking somebody if they've just put something in their pocket is fundamentally different to asking somebody if you can help them and them saying, no, I'm just looking, thanks, and you saying, I'll be right behind you if you need any help. One's very customer-centric and customer service in its language, and one's very accusational in its language, and they generate two different outcomes. The scale of retail crime is almost incomprehensible. It's reported at £2 billion a year, but as we all know, only a fraction of crime gets reported. FaceWatch can't be a sledgehammer to crack a nut. This nut isn't a small nut. This is a pretty significant issue that's happening in the world of retail today. FaceWatch has been really successful in capturing travelling gangs and prolific offenders up and down the UK, stealing high-value goods to order in a lot of cases.
If you think of a technology that looks at your face and then identifies whether or not you are potential risk to the supermarket or not, I think one thing that you have to think about is perhaps to draw an analogy and say, how would you feel if the supermarket asked you to give a fingerprint? You could make the argument that if everyone gave their fingerprint, that would result in less things being stolen, a safer environment for everybody, but it has the cost, my feeling of the lack of freedom, and obviously it has a cost in terms of, having to do this.
The difference between a fingerprint and facial features data is that a fingerprint can be hidden. If you're going about your life in a public space, there's basically no way that any kind of technology can kind of detect your fingerprint. With facial recognition, you can have cameras everywhere in any kind of public space that will capture your face. So unless you go outside with a paper bag on your head or something, then facial recognition technology will inevitably identify you. As soon as you're trying to go to the supermarket or just walking on the street, you will be scanned by these technologies. And that's the main problem, is that it's literally impossible to obtain people's consent to being scanned in this way when they enter their local supermarket. Even if you put up a sign at the entrance saying, your face will be scanned by facial recognition technology, first of all, how many people will actually read that sign? How many people will actually understand what this means, what the implications for their personal data, for their rights and freedoms are? Stores who had deployed FaceWatch technology could provide a list of suspicious people to the police. These people are suspicious based on the private actors' potentially racist and discriminatory assessment of why they're suspicious. This is not how policing works. There's very clear rules about who is a suspect, why they're a suspect, and what kind of enforcement you can take against them. So it's basically an expansion of surveillance and control over the population that is absolutely unacceptable.
So I often get asked, is FaceWatch a direct invasion on individuals' privacy? And clearly we wouldn't survive as a business if that was the case. We've made sure that that absolutely isn't the case. Through the growth of FaceWatch, there's been a lot written about AI and facial recognition particularly. A lot of it, I think, is a good narrative for the newspapers, storytelling, I call it. Things like you will be tracked and traced, you will be stopped from shopping. It has a high level of racial bias, none of which actually is true.
I'm not going to dismiss privacy concerns at all. We are subject to critical challenge from privacy pressure groups. You could call them civil liberties groups. I would include FaceWatch as a civil liberties group because we're in the business of protecting people's privacy, rights, and their other rights as well. We also have the right not to be assaulted, spat at, abused, to have our property stolen, to have our staff insulted. And that is a right, freedom from crime. So we are balancing all these rights. Privacy rights, the right not to have our privacy not unduly intruded upon, hence the instant deletion, with the right to be protected from crime, particularly when the police aren't there to do it. So we too are a strong advocate of people's rights. For a minimal intrusion into privacy, there is a great public benefit that goes far and wide in protecting people and property.
There's a question that often gets presented to me about being commercial and being ethical. Can you be both? Well, in this industry, you have to be. This is all about building trust, and you want anyone who interacts with your product and proposition to trust that you are acting ethically, professionally and lawfully. It's like any technology, you've got to deploy it responsibly. And FaceWatch has been very transparent in all its proceedings and actions today that gets us to a point where we feel very confident that we are treating people's personal data in a very responsible and trusting way.
Concerns about privacy have only been amplified by the pandemic, where technology has been rushed in to adjust to a new way of living and working. In early 2020, when coronavirus lockdowns came into force, businesses had to adapt and staff were asked to work from home. But because they weren't in the office, managers were concerned that they couldn't oversee the work that they were doing, so they looked to technology to solve that problem. Employee monitoring software does exactly that. You can collect data on what a staff member is doing through their computer, how many times they're moving the mouse, what they're typing into their keyboards, and you can even take screenshots of the computer screen and photos of you through the webcam. So naturally, privacy concerns were raised when this technology came into force. But is there a way to check on what staff are doing when they're working remotely without infringing on their privacy? We spoke to Adapt AI, who say that they've created such software that does this with ethical considerations at heart.
Hi, I'm David Lana. I'm the CEO of Adapt Limited. In an office, you would typically have your manager walking around, looking over shoulders and being able to see what's happening with their staff. They don't actually lean over and start reading emails. They don't actually start going to that individual's computer and looking at their Facebook posts. They don't need to. So we didn't need a software that did that either. We wanted a tool which would allow us to keep those eyes and ears, but we didn't want the spyware, which is typically out in the market. So we set our development teams the task of actually creating a software which they would like to see themselves, but wouldn't be intrusive or invasive into their day-to-day activities. We created a lightweight endpoint tool which doesn't capture any personal data, but gives you all the metrics that you would need to manage a team. There are a lot of different considerations that we had when developing Know Your Day. It wasn't just about looking at people's productivity. Ethically, we didn't want to capture data, as I say. We capture keystrokes, but we capture numbers of keystrokes. We're not interested in what's actually being typed. Secondly, by capturing this data, we'd need to store it. If we're now storing sensitive data, such as taking screenshots of people's activity throughout the day, if that database was ever to be hacked, that's a massive, massive security breach. So when considering these tools, just because you can capture somebody's screen, just because you can capture their geolocation and time, doesn't mean you need to. And I think that's at the heart of the essence of the services and the products that we develop, is looking at do we actually need that information to do the job in hand? Or is it just we're doing it because we're doing it?
So we've learned how data can impact privacy, but we also know that it can be used to improve services and make meaningful insights about an individual's behavior that can be used to sell them products. And the best way to harness this data and make those predictions is by using a technology called artificial intelligence.
The problem with artificial intelligence these days is that it's being used as a marketing buzzword. But when we hear about it in the news in the recent years, it's mostly to describe two things: neural network and machine learning. So what that means is that when before we were producing algorithms that would just deal with things in a hard-coded way, so say you have an apple, it's green, if it's green it goes on the left side, if it's red it goes on the right side. What machine learning and neural networks have changed is that rather than having these hard rules, you're training an algorithm to develop those rules by itself. And the way you do this is that you provide the algorithm with a data set of all the apples that you can find, say thousands or even millions of images of apples with the color, and say what should happen with this color. And the way it works is that the algorithm is going to process all of these images and create rules, so that when it's presented with a new case, it's going to be able to make a decision based on how they had been qualified in your data set. When you hear about artificial intelligence these days, this is mostly what we're referring to. It's kind of brute forcing a way to distinguish or to take a decision.
One way machine learning can be used is by looking at how your face moves and how your muscles are moving and trying to match that with an emotion. This is called emotional AI. Tech Labs are a company that have designed a wearable device that looks at your movements and tries to correspond that with an emotion.
I'm Ifi Mavridou. I'm the lead effect engineer at Tech Labs. We're building hardware and software solutions that can understand the human emotion. The hardware that we're building have integrated sensors for VR headsets together with glasses. The human emotion, as you know, is very, very complex, but there are different markers in our body that are signifying our emotions. So for example, when I'm happy, I might be smiling. When I am sad or confused, I might be frowning. And all of these are predominantly visible on the human face. We're actively now running studies with people with Parkinson's, people with facial palsy, people with depression, using our glasses in order to get a better understanding on how people respond to different scenarios and different activities. And building that will assist us in the future to create more solutions and more interventions that will help them on an everyday basis. Over time, you can see increases or decreases of the condition, you can see the different patterns, and if we're able to understand that and interpret that, then we will be able to provide actionable feedback and insights to the user, their therapists, and in the future to everyone who's using them. It's almost like using Fitbit for, instead of activity, you use it for the emotional states.
Tech Labs has the consent of its users because you have to physically wear it, but emotional AI has been used in public settings where it is harder to get that consent. Now, what does it mean when that technology is being used alongside things like facial recognition? This means that the technology can know who you are and potentially how you're feeling. But why would a company want to know that?
Emotional artificial intelligence at the moment is being used in marketing and advertising. A marketing campaign might be shown to an individual whilst they're being recorded, and then it's inferred from their expressions whether they enjoyed the campaign or whether it kind of does the things that the marketing company wants it to do. If people who are using advertising are tracking how people respond to certain adverts without people knowing about it, I think that could be really problematic, because we're taking information from people about how they're responding to situations without their consent. There could be huge implications if emotional AI could work at discovering whether someone was emotionally vulnerable. It could use targeted campaigns at those particular time points. And those campaigns could be, good, nice things, but they also could be horrible, terrible things. Advertising for gambling websites or different types of alcohol or junk food even, when people are feeling really low. It could be very good for businesses in targeting campaigns for specific time points and therefore saving them money, but it could be really devastating for the individual.
There are many misconceptions on the way that this data can be used or should be used. We can't make global observations and say that everyone fits under this umbrella. No, they don't. Like, even our facial expressions are completely different. That's why our approach is calibrated to the user. If you see a technology being misused for something, you should raise it as a concern. We should do something about that. But going forward, I think it's really, really important that we get more involved in the way that the technologies are made, developed and used. We should be a little bit skeptical, I guess, in the way that other technologies out there could be used.
Legislations usually cannot keep up with the advancement in technology. One recent example to this is the facial recognition technology, and EU's wishes to temporarily ban this technology. It's not just facial recognition, just AI, autonomous vehicles, Internet of Things. We are surrounded by the fast-pacing technologies and technological developments, and we are not quite sure to what extent we're ready for them.
However, we do have more principled legislation, such as human rights law or the General Data Protection Regulation, that are principle-based legislation that apply across society, across any kinds of activities. And it's very important that we remind ourselves that technology and its use by government, by corporations, does fall under this kind of legislation. So you can very well use the principles of human rights law and the principles of data protection to regulate the technology. The problem is today it's not sufficiently enforced. A lot of civil society are pushing for bans on certain kinds of dangerous technologies, such as lie detectors or biometric processing in public spaces. And bans are a good solution, but the thing is there's always going to be something next. So you always need to come back to human rights law and data protection legislation.
I would like to believe that any businesses that are using technology such as artificial intelligence is doing so with goodwill. So be it to improve people's lives or improve services, there's no such thing, I believe, as 100% ethical or 100% safe. If we stick to that, then basically we can't introduce any technology because everything will have potential harm. But as long as we design a social system, could be law or could be societal principles that can deal with those unintended consequences, I think we can put our faith in the technology.
When you're thinking about going through a process of deciding what is or isn't responsible, I think the first step is to map out the issue. What's the thing that you're looking at doing, right? Are you trying to implement an artificial intelligence program to make someone's life easier? I mean, we all have it on our phones. You know, you have an option of potentially using facial recognition software to open your phone. The benefit of it is that it's great for security, it's great for these many things. So you can paint the picture of the issue. You can start to think about, you know, from a company perspective, is this and our approach to this issue in line with our values, right? At the next stage of the process, you might actually start to look at what do stakeholders think. And you might find that stakeholders are petrified of the situation, or they might be ambivalent towards it. And I think it's really important at that stage to think about, okay, well, what's the gap between your position as a company and the values you've got and what stakeholders think? A famous example of this from a completely different space is, you know, Henry Ford apparently said, if you ask my customers what they want, they would say a faster horse. If you rewind 100 years or more, the company had to lead its stakeholders to understand that maybe a car was a good thing. When you come to technology, we might be in a position where people don't actually know. And in that space, it's really important to potentially, without patronizing your customers, to educate your customers about the risks And if you take the Ford example now, if you look at the emissions associated with carbon dioxide and cars, you might have said, actually, well, maybe the customers at that stage were right, but they maybe didn't know why they were right. And so when we look at responsibility, what is responsible changes because the world's changing. What we know about carbon is different now than 50 years ago. What we know about facial recognition now is different from what we will know. And that's the risk with technology, is that the way in which it could be used and can be used is still emerging.